The rain hit the glass doors of the Ashcombe Grand Hotel like static on an old television. Inside, under lights so bright they made everything look fake, Daniel Reyes stood at the front desk holding his daughter's hand, and the hotel manager was staring at him like he was something the storm had washed in. "Sir," the manager said, loud enough for the lobby to hear, "I already told you. You can't afford this room. Let's not make this harder than it needs to be." Behind Daniel, a small line of guests had stopped to watch. Some smirked. One woman pulled out her phone, angling it just slightly, the way people do when they think they're about to catch something worth posting. Daniel's daughter, Mia, 6 years old and soaked from the walk-in from the parking lot, tugged his sleeve. "Daddy, are we not staying here?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He looked at the manager, at the name tag that read Gregory Price, Assistant General Manager, and then at the elegant gold letters over the reception desk that spelled out a name Daniel knew better than his own reflection. "You should check your system again," Daniel said quietly. "Room 1401. Under Reyes." Gregory Price laughed, a short, ugly sound. "There's no reservation under that name, and even if there were, that suite runs $800 a night. I don't say this to be cruel, sir. I say it because I don't want you standing here embarrassing yourself, or your little girl, any longer than necessary." Somewhere behind the desk, a junior clerk named Priya was quietly typing, her eyes darting nervously between her monitor and her manager's back. She had seen something on the screen a minute ago. Something that made her stomach drop. But she hadn't said a word. Daniel looked down at Mia, forced a small smile so she wouldn't be scared, and then looked back up at Gregory. "You're going to want to say that a little quieter in about 10 minutes, he said. Gregory blinked, thrown for just a second by the calm in the man's voice. Then he scoffed and turned to call security. 3 weeks earlier, none of this would have seemed possible. Daniel Reyes was, to anyone who didn't know him, the most unremarkable man in any room. He was 41 years old, wore the same 3 flannel shirts on rotation, drove a 14-year-old pickup truck with a dent in the tailgate, and lived in a modest 2-bedroom house on the edge of a town most people only pass through on their way somewhere else. He worked with his hands. He kept his sentences short. He never raised his voice, not even when Mia spilled juice on his laptop or when the truck wouldn't start in the middle of winter. His wife, Elena, had died 3 years earlier. Complications after a routine surgery, the kind of thing nobody expects and everybody is told is extremely rare right up until it happens to them. After that, Daniel had folded his whole life down into one purpose, raising Mia. He cooked her breakfast every morning, braided her hair badly but with enormous care, and read her the same 3 picture books until the spines cracked. What almost nobody knew, because Daniel never spoke of it, was who he had been before all of that. Before the flannel shirts and the pickup truck, Daniel Reyes had spent nearly a decade building and selling companies most people would recognize if he said the names out loud, which he never did. He had made, and quietly reinvested, more money than entire small towns saw in a generation. Somewhere along the way, tired of boardrooms and bored of the version of success that other people wanted for him, he'd sold his stake in his last company, moved somewhere nobody knew his face, and decided the rest of his life would be measured in bedtime stories instead of quarterly earnings. He still owned things. Quietly. Through holding companies with names so boring nobody bothered to look twice. One of those things was the Ashcombe Grand Hotel chain. He hadn't visited one of his own properties in almost 2 years. That was about to change, because Mia's godmother, Daniel's late wife's sister, was getting remarried in 3 weeks at the very hotel where he now stood soaked from the rain, and Daniel had promised Mia they would stay the weekend and dance at the reception, just the 2 of them, like it was any other family in any other town. He hadn't told anyone who he was. He never did. It was simpler that way, and safer, and it meant that when people were kind to him, he knew it was real. The Ashcombe Grand sat at the top of a long circular driveway, its glass front doors flanked by stone lions that had been there since the hotel first opened, back when Daniel's grandfather, not Daniel himself, had built the very first location 2 towns over. The chain had grown a great deal since then. Most of the staff at any individual property had never even seen a photograph of the family that quietly still owned controlling shares. Which was exactly the problem. Gregory Price had been an assistant general manager at the Ashcombe Grand for 6 years. He was proud of the hotel, proud of its chandeliers and its reputation and its 5-star reviews, and he had built, brick by brick, a very specific idea of what kind of guest belonged inside it. Gregory judged people quickly. He judged the fit of a coat, the condition of a car and the valet line, the way someone said please or didn't. He wasn't unaware that this made him unpleasant. He simply believed it made him effective. When Daniel walked in that first evening, 3 weeks before the wedding, to confirm the room reservation his sister-in-law had made under the family's block booking, Gregory took one look at his wet flannel shirt, his scuffed boots, and the 6-year-old sleepily leaning against his leg, and made a decision before Daniel had said a single word. "Can I help you?" Gregory said, not quite a question. "I'm here to confirm a reservation," Daniel said. "It should be under Whitfield Reyes, for the Whitfield wedding block. Suite 1401. Gregory typed for a moment, frowning at the screen the way people do when they're performing diligence rather than actually doing it. "I'm not showing anything under that name for the presidential suite. I have a few standard rooms available at the back of the property, if that would suit you better." "Could you check under just Reyes?" Daniel asked patiently. The booking might have been split. Gregory sighed, the kind of sigh designed to be heard. "Sir, I've checked. There's simply no record of a reservation for that suite under your name. I don't want to waste your time. Perhaps this isn't the right property for you." It was such a small thing, that sentence. Perhaps this isn't the right property for you. But Priya, watching from 2 computers down, felt her face go hot on the man's behalf. She had seen the Whitfield Reyes reservation on the master system that morning. She knew it existed. She just didn't understand yet why Gregory was pretending otherwise, and she was too new, too afraid of her own job, to say anything. Daniel didn't argue. He simply nodded, told Mia they'd figure it out, and stepped aside to call his sister-in-law, who apologized and said she'd sort it out with the hotel's events coordinator the next morning. It was, Daniel told himself, a simple mix-up. He'd dealt with worse. He found a smaller hotel down the road for the night, tucked Mia into a lumpy queen bed, and didn't think much more of it. He should have. Because 2 days later, when Daniel came back to walk the wedding venue with his sister-in-law and helped carry chairs for the rehearsal setup, still in his work clothes, still saying very little, Gregory Price saw him again, and made an entirely different kind of assumption. He assumed Daniel was some kind of hired hand. A mover. Staff, maybe, from an outside vendor. "Excuse me," Gregory said, snapping his fingers lightly in Daniel's direction, "those chairs go along the east wall, not stacked by the terrace doors. And please use the service entrance next time, not the main lobby. We do have standards to maintain." Daniel set the chair down slowly. Across the room, his sister-in-law, Carla, went stiff with embarrassment. "Gregory," she said quickly, "this is Daniel, my brother-in-law." Mia's father. Gregory's expression didn't soften much. If anything, a flicker of something colder passed over it, the specific unease of a man who has just realized he might be wrong but hasn't yet decided to admit it. "My apologies," he said, in a tone that suggested he wasn't sorry at all. "I simply assumed, given the attire," he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Daniel just nodded again. "It happens," he said quietly, and picked the chair back up, and carried it exactly where Carla asked him to. But something in him had shifted, quiet and small, like a stone dropping into still water. Not anger, exactly. Daniel had made peace with anger a long time ago, it didn't fit into the life he'd built for Mia. It was something closer to recognition. He knew this type of man. He'd built companies staffed with men like Gregory, and he'd learned, over the years, that the cruelty wasn't usually about the person in front of them. It was about the story they'd already decided to tell about that person before they opened their mouth. The third incident happened the next morning, and it wasn't really about Daniel at all, which was somehow worse. There was an older woman working the hotel's breakfast service, a widow in her 60s named Ruth, who had been employed at the Ashcombe Grand for almost 11 years. Ruth moved a little slower than she used to. Her hands, worn soft with decades of carrying trays, sometimes shook faintly in the cold mornings. Daniel had noticed her the day before, refilling coffee with quiet, careful attention, the way people do when a job is the last thing tying their days together into a shape that makes sense. That morning, Ruth dropped a small pitcher of orange juice. It wasn't a disaster. A little juice splashed across the tile, nothing that couldn't be wiped up in 30 seconds. But Gregory happened to be walking through at that exact moment, trailing a family of well-dressed guests he was personally escorting to their table, and his face went tight with humiliation on their behalf. "Ruth," he said sharply, in front of everyone, "honestly. This is the third time this month. Maybe it's time we talk about whether the morning shift is still, well, manageable for you." Ruth's face went pale. She bent down immediately, apologizing over and over, her hands trembling harder now, not from age but from the specific shame of being scolded like a child in front of a room full of strangers. Nobody moved to help her. The well-dressed family looked away, uncomfortable, the way people often do when cruelty happens near them but not to them. Daniel was already crouched beside her before he'd even decided to move. "Let me get that," he said gently, taking the towel from her hands. "You go on and catch your breath a second." "You don't have to," Ruth whispered, mortified. "I'm alright, really, I know you're alright," Daniel said. "I'm not doing this because I think you can't. I'm doing it because 4 hands are faster than 2. It took him under a minute to clean the spill completely. When he stood back up, he looked, briefly, directly at Gregory. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "She's been on her feet since 5 in the morning," Daniel said. "Might be worth remembering that, before you decide what she can and can't manage." Gregory's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being spoken to that way, especially not by a man in a flannel shirt with a scuff on his boots. "This isn't your concern," he said stiffly. "No," Daniel agreed evenly. "But it should be yours." He walked away before Gregory could find a response, Mia's small hand back in his, leaving Ruth standing there with tears she was blinking back hard, and a strange, unfamiliar feeling that somebody, for once, had seen her. That evening, Priya found Ruth in the break room and asked, quietly, if she was okay. Ruth just shook her head and said, "That man. The one in the flannel. Did you see the way he looked at Gregory? Like he wasn't even worried." Priya had noticed something too. Something small. Earlier that day, doing a routine audit of the reservation system, she'd pulled up the master ownership file by accident, the one buried 3 folders deep that almost nobody at the property level ever opened. And she had seen, attached to a quiet internal memo about the hotel's holding structure, a name. D. Reyes. She told herself it was probably a coincidence. Reyes wasn't an unusual name. But it sat with her anyway, uneasy, the rest of the day. The 4th incident, the one that finally brought everything to its breaking point, happened the night of the confrontation the story had opened on. The wedding was 2 days away. Carla had asked Daniel to come stay at the hotel itself for the final 2 nights before the ceremony, since Mia was going to be the flower girl and there were early rehearsals, hair trials, all the small chaotic threads a wedding pulls taut before the day itself. The reservation had finally been sorted through the events team, or so Carla believed. She confirmed it herself, twice, with the coordinator named Beth, who had personally blocked Suite 1401 under the Whitfield Reyes wedding party. Nobody had told Gregory Price that the reservation existed under 2 names, because nobody imagined they needed to. It should have been a simple thing. A tired man and his daughter, walking in out of the rain, checking into a room that had already been arranged and paid for as part of a large wedding block that represented, incidentally, one of the largest single bookings the hotel had taken all year. Instead, Gregory looked at Daniel's soaked flannel shirt, his daughter's rain-flattened hair, the beat-up duffel bag slung over his shoulder instead of proper luggage, and made, for the 3rd time in 3 weeks, exactly the same mistake. "Sir," he said, in the lobby, loudly enough for the small gathered crowd to hear, "I already told you. You can't afford this room." It was the specific cruelty of the phrase that landed hardest. Not "can't stay here." Not "there's no reservation." "Can't afford." A judgment, dressed up as a fact, delivered in front of Daniel's daughter. Priya, at the desk, felt her stomach twist. She knew, this time, exactly who was standing in front of them. She'd looked it up properly that afternoon, unable to let the coincidence rest, cross-referencing the ownership memo against public filings on her phone during her break, hands shaking slightly at what she'd found. She opened her mouth to say something, anything, and then closed it again, terrified of what speaking up might cost her. Mia tugged Daniel's sleeve. "Daddy, are we not staying here?" And Daniel, calm as still water, looked at Gregory and said, "You should check your system again. Room 1401. Under Reyes." Gregory laughed, that short ugly sound, and reached for the phone to call security. That was the moment the whole lobby seemed to hold its breath. Security arrived within 2 minutes, a broad-shouldered man named Marcus who had worked at the Ashcombe Grand for almost as long as Ruth had. Marcus took one look at the situation, at the soaked, exhausted father, the frightened little girl, and the flush of self-righteous certainty on Gregory's face, and felt an immediate, uncomfortable itch of doubt. "Sir, I need you to step outside with me," Marcus said to Daniel, though his voice carried none of Gregory's contempt. It was almost apologetic. "Marcus," Gregory said, "escort him out. He's causing a disturbance and refusing to leave despite having no valid reservation." Before Marcus could take a single step, the front doors opened again, and a woman walked in shaking rain from her umbrella, dressed in a sharp navy suit, her expression already sharpening the moment she took in the scene. It was Beth, the events coordinator who had personally arranged the Whitfield-Reyes wedding block. She had been in a late meeting on the mezzanine level and had come down when a colleague texted her that something was happening in the lobby involving the wedding party. "What's going on here?" Beth asked, already moving toward the desk. "This man is refusing to leave," Gregory began. "He's claiming a reservation under Reyes," Beth interrupted, her eyes going wide. "Wait. Daniel Reyes?" The lobby went very quiet. "You know him?" Gregory asked, some of his certainty beginning to crack. "Gregory," Beth said slowly, carefully, "the way you speak to someone standing near the edge of something they can't see yet. Room 1401 has been reserved under the Whitfield-Reyes wedding block since the day the contract was signed. I confirmed it myself. Twice." She turned to Daniel, her face flushing with mortification. "Mr. Reyes, I am so sorry, I don't know how this happened, I promise you this is being fixed right now." "You keep saying his name like it means something," Gregory said, frustration creeping into his voice now, the frustration of a man who feels the ground tilting beneath him and doesn't yet understand why. Beth hesitated. She glanced at Daniel, an unspoken question in her eyes, a kind of permission she was silently asking for. Daniel gave the smallest nod. "It means something because it's on the building, Gregory," Beth said quietly. "The holding company that owns this hotel, and 11 others in this chain, is Reyes Family Holdings. I only know because I had to route the wedding block's corporate discount approval through the ownership office 3 weeks ago. This is Daniel Reyes. He owns the Ashcombe Grand." For a long moment, nobody in the lobby moved. Somewhere behind the desk, Priya let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for 3 days. Marcus took an instinctive step back from Daniel, not out of fear exactly, but out of the sudden, dizzying recalibration people feel when the floor turns out to be a different shape than they thought. Gregory's face went through several colors in rapid succession. That's not possible, there would have been a notice, a photograph, something, we would have known." "I don't usually visit properties in person," Daniel said. It was the first thing he'd said since the accusation had landed. His voice was still calm, still quiet, but there was a weight to it now that hadn't been there in the flannel shirt and the rain-soaked boots a few minutes earlier. "I find people treat me more honestly when they don't know who's watching." Gregory opened his mouth. Nothing came out. "I want to be very clear about something," Daniel continued, and though his volume never rose, every person in that lobby leaned in to hear him. "This isn't about the room. I've slept in worse places than a hotel lobby floor. What bothers me is that you looked at a tired man and a frightened 6-year-old, and instead of curiosity, or even basic decency, you decided the fastest, easiest thing to do was humiliate us both in front of a crowd. And you did the same thing 3 days ago, to a woman old enough to be your mother, over a spilled pitcher of orange juice." Gregory's face drained of color entirely. He hadn't realized Daniel had connected those two moments. He hadn't realized anyone connected them. I run companies, Daniel said, or I used to. I learned a long time ago that you can tell everything you need to know about a person's character not by how they treat the people who can help them, but by how they treat the people they think can't. Ruth had come out from the breakfast area at some point during the commotion, drawn by the sound of raised voices, and stood now near the edge of the lobby with her hand pressed to her chest. Priya watched her employer, a man who had scolded an elderly widow in front of strangers just days earlier, stand frozen and speechless in front of the one man in the building who apparently had the power to end his career with a single phone call. Mr. Reyes, Gregory finally managed, his voice unrecognizable now, stripped of all its earlier certainty. I had no idea. If I had known, that's exactly the problem, Daniel said quietly. You shouldn't need to know who I am to treat me like a person. He turned to Marcus, who was still standing there looking faintly ill at the thought of how close he'd come to physically removing the hotel's owner from his own lobby. You're not in trouble, Daniel told him gently. You were doing your job with the information you were given. That's not a crime. Marcus exhaled, relief flooding his face. Then Daniel turned to Beth. Thank you for stepping in. That took some courage. It's your hotel, sir, Beth said, still flustered. I just told the truth. Sometimes that's the harder thing to do, Daniel said. He crouched down then, in the middle of the lobby, in front of Mia, who had been watching the entire exchange with wide, confused eyes, unsure why the mean man from before now looked like he might be sick. Hey, Daniel said softly, just to her. You okay? Mia nodded slowly. Are we in trouble? No, baby, Daniel said, brushing a damp strand of hair from her forehead. Nobody's in trouble but the people who were being unkind. And even they're going to get a chance to do better. The days that followed the confrontation in the lobby were, by design, far less dramatic than the moment itself. Daniel had never been the kind of man who enjoyed watching people squirm, even people who deserved a measure of discomfort. What he cared about was what came next, not the spectacle of the reveal itself. The following morning, he sat down with the hotel's general manager, a woman named Louise who had been on vacation the week everything happened and returned to find her assistant manager pale and shaking and asking to speak with her immediately. Daniel asked Louise to gather a small group, not for punishment, he said, but for a conversation. In that meeting, Daniel didn't shout. He didn't threaten anyone's job on the spot, though everyone in the room fully expected him to. Instead, he asked questions. He asked Gregory to explain, honestly, what had gone through his mind each time he'd looked at Daniel and decided, instantly, that he didn't belong. Gregory struggled to answer, because the honest answer was uncomfortable. He had judged a man by his clothes, by the wear on his boots, by the flatness of his voice, and he hadn't questioned that judgment once, not with Daniel, and not with Ruth. I'm not going to pretend this doesn't have consequences, Daniel said finally. But I want to be fair about what those consequences are, and fairness means looking at the whole picture, not just the moment that embarrassed you the most. He turned first to Marcus. You followed the information you were given, and the moment new information arrived, you adjusted. That's actually what I want from someone in your position. No consequences for you. If anything, I'd like to see you considered for a supervisory role, if you're interested. Marcus, stunned, managed only a nod. He turned to Priya next. You saw something you weren't sure how to act on, and you were scared, and that's human. I'm not going to punish you for hesitating. But I do want you to know that speaking up earlier, even quietly, even just to your manager's supervisor, might have spared a lot of people a difficult afternoon. I'd like you to remember that, not as guilt, but as something to carry forward. He paused. I'd also like to offer you a position in our corporate guest relations training program, if you want it. You clearly notice things other people miss. That's worth developing. Priya's eyes filled with tears. Thank you, Mr. Reyes. Finally, he turned to Gregory. You've built a hotel that runs efficiently, Daniel said. The reviews reflect that. But efficiency without decency isn't the kind of hotel I want my name attached to, even quietly, even behind a holding company nobody's heard of. You made an assumption about who deserved your respect and who didn't, not once, but at least twice in the same week, and one of those times, it wasn't even about me. It was about Ruth. That tells me it isn't really about status or appearances. It's about who you've decided matters. Gregory's shoulders sagged. I understand if you want to let me go. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. I'm not going to fire you today, he said finally, and the surprise in the room was audible. I've had 6 years of reviews on your work ethic, and they're genuinely strong. People don't become the way you were in that lobby by accident, Gregory. Somewhere, someone taught you that treating people well was conditional. I'm not interested in punishing you for a lesson someone else handed you. I am interested in whether you're willing to unlearn it. He laid out the terms plainly. Gregory would remain in his role on a formal probationary review, with mandatory training focused specifically on guest dignity and staff treatment, conducted in part by Ruth herself, who Daniel quietly asked whether she'd be willing to help design. He would also personally, sincerely, apologize to Ruth, not as a performance for Daniel's benefit, but in private, on her terms. If, 6 months from now, this happens again, Daniel said, to anyone, guest or staff, there won't be a third conversation. But I'd rather give a man a real chance to become someone better than fire him and never find out if he could have. Gregory nodded, throat tight, and for the first time since the confrontation began, looked less like a man caught in a lie and more like a man who had just been handed something he didn't fully feel he deserved. Ruth's part of the story ended more gently than anyone expected. When Daniel found her later that day, refilling coffee with the same careful, steady hands, he didn't make a show of thanking her or drawing attention to what had happened. He simply asked if she'd be willing to help train new staff on how to treat guests and co-workers, with the kind of patience she'd shown for 11 years without anyone noticing. I've never trained anyone before, Ruth said, startled. Then it's about time somebody asked, Daniel replied. The wedding, when it finally arrived 2 days later, was everything Carla had hoped for, and Daniel danced with Mia on his shoulders during the last song of the night, her small hands pressed over his eyes, both of them laughing, while the same lobby that had nearly turned them away now glowed warm and golden with string lights and quiet applause. Late that evening, after Mia had fallen asleep in the suite that had, in fact, been reserved under his name the entire time, Daniel stood by the window and looked out over the wet, glittering parking lot below, thinking about the version of the story people would probably tell each other afterward. The rich man revealed. The manager humiliated. The satisfying justice of it all. But that wasn't really the part that mattered to him. What mattered was Priya, who would spend the rest of her career now trusting her instincts a little more. What mattered was Marcus, promoted not because he'd groveled but because he'd simply done his job with integrity. What mattered was Ruth, finally seen, finally valued, finally handed a piece of respect that had been owed to her for 11 quiet years. And what mattered, even, was Gregory, who now had the rare and uncomfortable gift of a second chance he hadn't asked for and wasn't sure he deserved, but had been given anyway. Daniel had learned a long time ago that money could buy almost anything except the one thing that actually determined whether a person was good, what they did when they thought no one who mattered was watching. He hadn't come back to that lobby to teach anyone a lesson. He'd come back for his daughter, and a wedding, and a room that should have simply been his, no questions asked. The rest, the reveal, the reckoning, the quiet redistribution of respect and grace, had simply followed, the way consequences do when honesty finally catches up to pretense. Somewhere below, the hotel lights reflected in puddles left over from the storm, and Daniel Reyes, once again just a tired father in a flannel shirt, turned away from the window and went to sleep beside his daughter. In the end, the truest measure of a man was never what he could afford. It was what he was willing to give away.